Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Shimbari, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Have a Life Teaching podcast. We talk a lot about curriculum, instruction, and in many of our conversations, we also talk about assessment. And it's key to be assessing our students as they're learning. Yes, we want our students engaged, but one issue that sometimes happens when I go in and observe classrooms is I do see students engaged in having fun and activities, and that's great. But how does it loop back to the learning objectives so that we're assured that our students are actually learning the content that we need to learn? And we're going to be speaking about that with our guests tonight. And then the other area of assessment that I see often as a lost opportunity is this idea that assessment has to be a paper and pencil test. There are so many other ways that we could be not only assessing our students through, for example, project-based learning, but also ways in which we involve the students in the evaluation of their own learning. I'm really excited to have Nicole Dimich talking about her brand new book, Design in 5, which is going to talk all about different ways we should be assessing. So, Nicole, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So, Nicole, how did assessment practice become your area of interest?
Such a great question. Was a teacher and I, of course, an educator and have worn multiple hats. And part of my passion has always been to create space for possibility. When somebody sees possibility in you before you see it in yourself is so powerful. And I mean, that's the gift educators give young people all of the time. And so fast forward a bit, I was engaged in my teaching work. I was doing an interdisciplinary team and then kind of fell into facilitating conversations and then started to facilitate conversations around assessments. And so what would happen was teams would bring in an assessment and the student work, and we would look at the assessment to say, does it align to standards? And then we would look at the student work to look at misconceptions and then understand what the impact of our teaching was and what we could do differently. And one of the things I noticed is that there are so many moments where we could create really engaging spaces for young people in classrooms with instruction and activities. And then when it got to the assessment, fell flat. And it was the stop everything and assess, and then assessment even started to become so influenced by external measures of assessment. And so then that led to educators being incredibly stressed and young people, students, scholars being incredibly stressed. I realized very quickly that assessment was being seen as evaluation and not as a process of information. Using assessment not to build possibility, but to actually just shut kids down and even shut educators down. Design in 5 emerged over multiple years of sitting down with teams of teachers and talking with young people and students to say, how are you experiencing assessment? How are you experiencing grading? What is it like to be you in school? And so we started to design ways that we could create assessments that really focused on learning. And then how we're not only were we making sure, like you mentioned in the introduction, that we're making sure that what we want our young people, our students to learn, the learning objectives, the standards are being assessed by our assessments. That's a whole thing. That's a technical part of assessment. Does the item and task that we're using actually reflect the learning? And certainly we want that to be part of it. And then we also want students to be able to make sense of that assessment in terms of their strengths and their next steps. And so that's what was happening so often is in the design of the assessments, it was, oh, you got a 2. Oh, so I am a 2. Or you got a 67%. Oh, you are at 67%. Instead of understanding that 2 and that 67% underneath that was information about strengths. What are your learning strengths? And then the mistakes, well, oftentimes to just shut students down. Mistakes and errors are often that opportunity to say, where do I go next? So Design in Five became this framework as I was sitting down with a bunch of folks and say, how do we do this efficiently and effectively so that we first understand that assessment is information and then we don't, and to your point about there's lots of different methods of assessment. Assessment doesn't just have to be paper pencil, it has to be meaningful. And so that's the other part of Design in Five is choosing standards, but also talking about why this is important and not just because it's going to be on a test, but what is the meaningful work that students can engage in either in discussion, in dialogue, in creation, where they start to understand that assessment evidence is learning and not just a hoop to jump through.
Something that really resonates with me with what you said is not just looking at assessment as evaluation, as
Mhm.
something that comes at the end, that's summative assessment, but using it as a process for getting information. Because again, you can, like to your example, you could look at a 67% and say, oh, I'm not good at something. When in reality, if you're using that to formulate what the student is good at to get that 67 and what they might want to work on next, that's a much more powerful way of using assessment and using information to help all of us on this growth trajectory. Talk about this Design in Five being a process. Could you describe what are the steps in the Design in Five process?
Absolutely, happy to do that. So it actually went from a linear phase one, two, three, four, five to a circular graphic phase one, two, three, four, five, because each of the phases are potentially entry points based on where people have been before. Because oftentimes people aren't entering this work initially as the very beginning. Phase one is I usually ask folks to take a standard or I'm sorry, a unit or a cycle or a module. So to choose kind of a time frame they want to design for. And then they choose standards or competencies or learning, however they're describing their learning. What do you want some level of mastery to be in this time frame? And then alongside of that in phase one is why is this important? So really understanding who our young people are and our students are and really creating a sense of engagement, not just engagement in, oh, participate and follow along with me and be in it, but engagement in terms of what is a relevant question that we might ask within this module or unit. And sometimes that's already embedded and sometimes it's not. And or the engagement could be something like students are in this module, they're going to study food deserts and make sure that their product or whatever the assessment is going to offer potential solutions to a local or global issue, such as a food desert or something to that effect. So as we dive into phase one, it can be as simple as what do you want students to learn and define that. And then those who are really ready for a deeper dive into using assessment as engagement and meaningful work will dive into that a little bit more even up front. And then phase two is taps into kind of that traditional unpacking or deconstructing. Sometimes when you say unpacking or deconstructing standards, you get a collective groan in the room because that is a process that we have sometimes executed at nauseum. Really, the idea of phase two is laddering and analyzing standards and laddering. And essentially, that does take standards or the learning descriptions and then asks folks to tease it apart into learning goals or learning targets. Sometimes people talk about it in that regard. So we try to figure out what are all of the what I call rungs on the ladder, the prerequisite, where we want everyone to be, and then that deeper dive. And then we take those learning goals or learning targets, whether they're designed in that phase or we're pulling them from other work folks have done, and we put them in a progression. And that's the ladder. And sometimes people use a different symbol, but the whole idea is that we're creating a roadmap for students to achieve the learning and also for educators to follow along as we, and of course, it would be lovely if students learned everything in order, and that's not the case, but having a roadmap helps you and students really understand where to go. So that ladder learning progression is really the foundation for young people being able to understand what the learning looks like. So then that happens, and then phase 3 turns into an assessment plan. So once we know where we want to go, this is really the beginning with the end in mind and the backwards design that we're all very familiar with that Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe a long time ago set us up for. It's just the assessment part a little bit tighter. Usually I'll have folks list those learning goals that they want students to master, and then we will either align items that we have already kind of deemed we're going to use and make sure that they line up. We'll develop new ways and new methods. So this is where we get multiple methods. Maybe there are moments where we can do an interview, or students can create a graphic organizer or produce a presentation or do research in that. So we have this learning progression, and then we are thinking through what are all the different methods we can use to collect evidence of learning that kids are either in dialogue or they're creating or they're producing. That's where we start to see and make sure that there's all these different ways to do that. And that's where the beautiful part of personalizing can come in too, because once we have our learning progressions and understand the criteria, there are multiple ways that students can show their understanding and get feedback and continue to grow. So the assessment plan, and then also within that context, whether you're going to design something that's more end of unit-ish, or sometimes people call it using it summatively, or more checks for understanding, or the formative checks along the way that of course are only formative if we respond and students respond. But this assessment plan can help us more intentionally decide where we're going to provide kids more feedback. So we're not assessing constantly, but we're assessing in very intentional moments that are more formative in nature, where there will be response. So teachers can feel a little bit more like this is a manageable flow of assessment and instruction and process. So the assessment plan is phase 3. And then phase 4 is all the logistics. It's like jam-packed with how do you write a good rubric, a good proficiency scale, a rubric, if you're using multiple choice intentionally, if you're using constructed response, if you're doing a project. So essentially has all of the technical aspects. Once you have the plan, you can use the information or the quality guidelines to either critique and revise assessments or design from scratch. So that's 4. And then finally, phase 5 is the student investment side of it. So within the context of the assessment itself, no matter what it looks like, how do we design a scoring scheme so students understand that score, whatever it looks like, whether it's a rubric, whether it's points, whether it's whatever it is, that they understand what that score means in terms of learning and their strengths and their next steps. And that's the second part of what's the reflection that's going to happen. I think the thing that makes my process just potentially a little bit different is just connecting the engagement side of it with the progression within the design students are reflecting. So that's 5 phases in a nutshell. More.
I love it. And I love, like you said, how it's all connected, because that's how you ensure that the assessment is going to A, make sure that our students are meeting certain learning standards. But at the same time, if we're thinking about it before the students are actually sitting in front of us in the classrooms, how to actually make it engaging and potentially fun at the same time. So when I said before, oh, I see assessment that's fun, that it's not aligned to anything. I don't want people to think that I'm against fun or I'm against engagement. It's just, how do you make sure all those pieces are
Mhm.
there? And
Mm.
your process really talks about that. And I could see why you would do it or you would have models of it in a circle, because one affects the other. So you're going to look at how students have performed in this assessment. You're going to revise those rubrics. You're going to go back and revise those activities, those assessment activities. And you're going to go back and make sure that the students have met those learning targets within the standards that you're prioritizing. I have a follow-up question. What
Mhm.
would you recommend to say? I'll give you a scenario, a school that's very traditional in
Mhm.
their assessment. So I'm going to give you the profile of a school or a school district where teachers look at their textbook and they give section quizzes that are already in the textbook.
Mhm.
Then they give a chapter test at the end. And then come March, they drop everything and prepare for state tests.
Yeah.
How would you recommend a school or a district like that make the transition to
Mhm.
design in 5? What would be some of the low hanging fruit that a district like that could do or pluck to
Mhm.
get into this process without feeling overwhelmed?
Yeah, great question. Absolutely. Yes, I think the first thing that often we enter point is I talk a little bit or we describe like what are some of the qualities of assessment, like precision and action and student investment, like the higher level qualities. And then one of the first things to do is to say, let's look at one of those assessments you're using and let's put those learning goals right on the assessment. So what did you want students to really achieve in this unit? And if folks have been doing this a while, they really know what are the most important things students need to learn within a context of a unit and what is like a bigger struggle for them. And so usually I'll just say let's just put learning goals right on the assessment. And then if you're using points, let's just see where the points fall. How, like, what percentage of the assessment itself is on each of those learning goals. And that can just help us ensure that what we are currently assessing is what we are teaching and what we think is most important. And of course, is aligned to standards, but that often is a really great first step. Sometimes I will start with, or we will start with looking at a unit and saying, okay, if this is the end of the unit, where do kids need a little bit more time to learn? What is essential to know, hard to teach, hard to learn, but worth more instructional time? And let's do a formative quiz or a draft of a student work before the end of the unit. And let's look at the results together and see who's getting it, who's not, what are the misconceptions. That part of the process is huge because that's usually the entry point where folks can start to uncover, oh, you know what? I think it is worth our time to go back and redesign our assessments because this really didn't assess what we thought it would be. And so the last chapter is file, stack, and plan, where we actually look at the student work. And that is a great first step to get back into the actual process. And I've done that, like with one of the schools in Minneapolis. I spent 2 years and we would look at the student work and then we would identify misconceptions and say, where does it fall? And that was the entry point to say, oh, you know what? We need to do a deeper dive. And is this the assessment that we really want our students to be taking, or is there something more meaningful as a result? I think the other thing that happens, usually I'll share with folks some kind of like, let's look at your overall score and like, what do we think that means? And really brainstorm, how do we share results with students in a little more intentional way so that they can get information? Because so often students get everything that they're doing wrong back and they don't get things that they're doing right, which often leads to how much is this worth? And kids are only doing the assignments that are worth a larger amount of points. And so that usually also gets us in settings that are kind of at the beginning of the process or have more traditional practices that may or may not have been working to get kids to be compliant, but also potentially not invested in what they're doing.
I'm glad that you said that because that segues nicely into the scenario I was about to give you, which is a school or a school district that is further along in this journey, that
Mm,
is using their PLC time, for example, to look at student work. They are making sure that their assessments are aligned to the learning targets. And they are doing those formative quizzes along the way to make sure that if students are struggling, they're catching those things
yeah.
before the summation assessment, right? Whether that's a state exam or the chapter test. Let's say the school is further along and they're doing all that. You were just mentioning students having ownership,
Hmm.
students not just receiving a score or a grade, but really being communicated with
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
terms of, well, this is where you are, where are we going with this?
Yeah.
So for a school that is ready for that, how would you recommend schools involve students in assessment and analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. So phase 5, chapter 6 is all like jam packed with ways or different ways of thinking about how students can be even more integral in what their assessment looks like and sharing their work. This is one area exactly that people who are further along in the process love to dive into. So what are all the different ways that we have students reflect on the assessment results? And so there are so many different ways. So I do have a Google folder that accompanies the book because that has like examples by grade level and discipline because our youngest, our our pre-K and kindergarten and first graders, that looks different when they're reflecting on their learning, can do it and they do it beautifully. And so certainly there are some examples of how people have taken the learning goals in a ladder, and a young person is using the ladder to assess their work. And so there's like a video that accompanies that where students can, the learning goals sometimes are something that we as teachers hold. How are we sharing it with students so they can mark and track kind of where they're going and how much evidence they have with each learning goal being addressed? The other thing, that the assessment plan itself, when you have the learning goals, like a lot of people will give folks or students like, this is what we're going to do during this unit. Some are now giving them, here are the learning goals. And then students are noting when they have evidence of mastery based on the learning goals. So then that's taking the assessment plan and having students track and say, okay, now I have evidence here. And then the next step of that is to asking students to co-design. What are some of the ways that we can have you engaging or researching, or what is the other evidence you have that shows you have mastered this evidence of learning? Almost kind of some of the gaming mentality, or this is where we're all going to go. And so do I have enough evidence? What are all of the options that I can, as a young person, decide that, okay, I'm going to do this to show my learning. And then the teacher is ensuring that, of course, there are things that students need to learn sometimes in order to be able to share the evidence in whatever form we're asking them to engage in. But when you're starting to co-design or co-construct with students that learning journey, it's beautiful. So I think a lot of folks are dabbling, and that goes with the personalized learning, but it also goes with, and not that students are just doing whatever they want to do. Choice is a huge part of it, but it's in the context of a teacher guiding and asking questions so that it's meaningful and deep work and not just surface level, because that can happen really easily if we're not careful.
Love how you're really touching on, Nicole, a lot of other topics we've talked about. So we've talked about questioning and the
Mhm.
questions that we ask our students. So when you were just saying getting students involved in analysis, is it surface analysis, or are we really asking students, like you were saying, to show the evidence of where they are in meeting a certain standard, and then having them determine with consultation with the teacher in terms of how do I get to that next step? What is that next step? You've also talked about gaming in a way and how that actually aligns with gaming. And that is true because people, human nature, maybe not all humans, but a lot of humans do like to know where they are and how they get to the next level. So bringing in those concepts into assessment and gamifying assessment could definitely be a way to get students vested in the process. You were mentioning something before, Nicole, and before we move on to another topic that I want to get your take on homework. It might not be in the design by in 5, but I want to get your take on homework. But
Totally,
before we
totally.
do that, you were mentioning having students, like I said, determine or have evidence to show where they are. Now, I could see that working definitely for middle school or high school, but as you said, your younger kids, might or might not be able to do that. So could you give us an example for teachers teaching lower grades, how they could start to get students involved in self-assessment?
Absolutely. I worked with actually a pre-K and kindergarten group in California, and they were learning, of course, to write letters and words, letters to words to stories to make meaning. And so the teachers had created a rubric that was all based on the different levels of student work. So from showing pictures to share your story, to pictures with beginning letters, to multiple letters, to words, and the students could really see how the writing progressed. But if you were at the beginning and using pictures, that was still a writer. You're still in a picture. And then they had co-created that at the carpet every morning. Like, what does a good writer do? What are some of the things that we do? And that's where they were bringing in letters and all of these things. Well, then they made little post-it notes that said, I am here because, and I'm going here. And so every student then had their own writing journal, and they had that little post-it note that said, I am at a level 2 because I have pictures with beginning words. And the teachers, as kids were writing, I mean, certainly a lot of younger students, if they don't have the words, they can't write necessarily, but the teacher had set it up so beautifully where students were engaged in writing in their journals, and then she could easily pull a student aside and say, well, which picture do you think best matches your writing? And then they would do that. And then she would say, why do you think that is? And she'd write it down. What do you need to do to move to the next level? Oh, I need to figure out. And so it was just a beautiful way of, so it's kind of that engagement. It's like instruction and assessment as one in the same. It's the process. A couple of my colleagues also have students have the learning goals on cards, and they are then on a like a key ring. And so as students are able to show that they understand how to do this, they will punch those learning targets so that they can track where they're at. And that's a big shout out to my colleague Brian Butler and his team in Fairfax County. So certainly, like, there's lots of different ways to have young people just think about, oh, is this right? Where am I at? How confident am I? What does this mean for me? Oh, it means I know how to do this. And then what's my next step? So much of that is engaging students in reflecting on their work and connecting it to what they're doing, to what they're learning. And that's the journey all the way through, is to help students become learners so that they understand, so that they can more independently. So it's not the teacher having to say, here, this is how you get better. That when we have those descriptions, students start to be able to get to the point where they can say, okay, this is what I know I need to do. Here's what I need to do next. What do I need to learn in order to move there?
Exactly. And that's a life skill that we all need, particularly as we get older and people aren't holding our hand. And so, how are we, even from those early years, training our students to be self reflective,
Mm-hmm.
to
Yeah.
be proactive as opposed to reactive and expecting someone else to tell us what we need to do? Now, of course, obviously, we want our teachers to do that with our students, but how do we, again, help them to be proactive learners? So I'm glad that you mentioned that. As I was saying, Nicole, it might not be necessarily in design in five, but what are your thoughts on homework as a form of assessment? Because I have my own thoughts on this.
Yeah.
And I'd be curious, as an assessment expert, what you think about this.
No, I love this. That's such a great question because it's integral to assessment. I mean, it is because it's used on so many different and for so many different purposes. There's multiple purposes for homework, and certainly the research is not that resounding when it comes to homework being being a strategy to help kids learn more, for all of the obvious reasons. If students leave class not knowing how to do homework, they, even if they do it, they might go back and do it wrong, go home and do it wrong, or have somebody else do it or help them do it to whatever level, and then they come in the next day, and if they have done it wrong, you have to help them unlearn and then relearn. And if they haven't done it, sometimes all it is a compliance piece. Like, did you do your homework? And so we're checking it off. And so now this becomes a power struggle that's more about compliance instead of evidence of learning. And so homework is really tricky because of all the reasons of just who's doing it. Does it really tell us? Like, is it more of a perceived effort? And it's very difficult to understand like what is happening for young people once they leave our our doors. And so if we're making assumptions about the reasons why kids do homework or don't do homework, that can be incredibly problematic, and it can shut kids down pretty quickly. So I do a lot of focus groups. So actually I did actually, one of them, a math department that I worked with, they wanted to understand why kids were doing homework or why they weren't, because they weren't seeing high levels of kids doing homework. And so I ran a focus group and I said, tell me about homework. And one of the questions I ask is, does homework help you learn? And what you might expect, students who really knew how to do it, and that's what they would say. If I know how to do it and I need a little more practice, then it helps me. But if I don't know how to do it, I'm just frustrated and I go home and I'm so confused. And then either I don't do it or I go and try and find the answers just to get it done. And in fact, one student said, you know what, I can spend 35 minutes on homework or 5 minutes on homework and I get the same grade. And so why would I do this? And so there was this like sense of, as kids get older, some homework can be potentially useful, but you've got to have a clear purpose for it. And if students can do if they do no homework, but they show evidence of understanding what we wanted them to learn, then they don't need to do homework.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's have them do the notion of responsibility and accountability needs to be quality work, not just completion of work and more counting of things. And I think that's where I see it happening so often is students will do all of these extra things to get more points, to get a higher grade, but that doesn't equate to more learning. Then that is just, it's really more busy work sometimes. And again, there are some times where the purpose of homework is to work, to continue a project or to work on, and that's certainly there's different like ways in which we think about that, but homework as a traditional thing often doesn't work very well. I'll give you a quick story. My son was a sophomore during the pandemic and he did nothing, hardly anything at all. So it was one day though, he came running up the stairs and he's like, Mom, guess what? He was taking an American Sign Language class. And it was a midterm, and of course she had to do an interview over Zoom, and she did it. And he showed up, thank goodness. And at the end of the interview, she said, Reese, you know everything that's most essential. So I'm going to exempt you from all of the little assignments. And looked at me and he's like, Mom, I think I'm going to take ASL too. Teacher had that beautiful moment where she shifted from everything being about compliance to it being about evidence of learning. And that helped her too. So this whole like evidence of learning piece it is for young people to understand that their work and their assessments are about learning, but it's also to ease the burden that teachers have when they're constantly trying to get kids to do things that may or may not contribute to their learning. Now again, it's a different
Exactly.
if somebody needs to do it for practice and needs more help.
Why do we give students 50 problems at the same complexity level? Why
Yes,
not give them 4 problems at different complexity levels?
yes,
So we can
yes,
see what they know and don't know, and then use that to redirect our instruction during the day. It's less hassle for the teacher, it's
yes,
less stress for the student, it's certainly less stress for the family because I still have nightmares, Nicole, of my mother and sister screaming at each other during homework time. I
yes,
still have nightmares about that.
yes.
They rammed heads like you would not believe. And that was I don't even want to say how long ago that was.
No, no. We could, like, relieve a lot of that, and to your point, shouting out another colleague, my Tom Schimmer, his Grading from the Inside Out has a whole chapter on repurposing homework because it is just such a beautiful it can be such a beautiful way to think differently about homework and that it's not this thing that needs to be equated to rigor or responsibility if we really reposition it.
Now, another what's your take kind of question. And the question is this. In my consulting work, Nicole, a lot of schools I work in, they drop everything and they start preparing for state exams in March. And they ask me all the time, how do I do this? How do I do this? And I will often say, well, don't drop everything and start in March. Do a
Right.
diagnostic assessment that has an interim assessment. So you're assessing your students along the way. So you ensure that your everyday instruction is targeting the standards that the kids need to master. That's,
Mhm.
in my opinion, much more effective than cramming everything in March. What do you recommend to schools that you consult in that drop everything to do test prep in March on?
Yeah, great question. And so yeah, in the introduction to Design in Five, actually, I identify multiple shifts, and one of the shifts, of course, is evaluation to information, but the other is from over tested. Because so many systems feel over tested, and they feel like everything they need to do needs to line up to that external assessment, and that's going to deliver results. And the research is just really clear. If everything lines up to that standardized assessment and kids are constantly being assessed, even in a unit that is in the same format as the external assessment, they may get a little bump the first year, but then it usually takes a dive because the fatigue sets in. And certainly the research will say that when you ask students, how would you do better on this assessment in systems like that, where they're cramming for the test and it's all about that, kids tend to say, well, I've got to be a better test taker. So, of course, what happens is when they get to something on an external assessment, they don't know how to think it through if they don't know the answer. And so they either guess, skip it, or not are not able to even persevere through it. So when I looked at like just the bigger picture of external assessments, I looked at like the different purposes. And external assessments, the best use of those is to look at patterns of that external assessment, ACT, AP, IB exams, even the state exam or provincial exams over time to help us understand which groups of students are being served well in the system and which groups of students need something different. So it's really information for the adults in the system, even though some of those scores certainly give kids access to certain things, not as much as anymore because we understand the limitations of those larger scale assessments on individual achievement indicators. So I'll usually help people say, look, let's really think about what the purpose is, knowing that they are used for purposes in which they weren't intended in our context, including realtors, but that's another story. Another story, right? But so that's that. But then I'll usually say, 2 to 3 times a year are, like you said, interim. It's really important for students to understand what the assessment looks like at the external assessment and then to get some experience in it. But usually when those interim assessments are happening and they're lined up to the end of year assessment, we may or may not have had students have a level of mastery on the standards that are being assessed. So in an interim assessment, you may or may not see students growing or not growing based on what the curriculum has been mapped out in terms of some level of mastery. And so interim assessments, super interesting and important so that kids get experience in the way the test is set up, even to understand the blueprint of that test, to understand like what portions of the assessment are on, some of the standards. And the external assessment can't assess in the same way that gives us and students really good information about the extent to which students have mastered it to a deep level. Certainly those large scale assessments are field testing items. So they can do things that on a classroom assessment level doesn't work as well because, we're often not field testing items against other pieces or other items. And so usually I'll say, yeah, let's look at it. Let's look as adults to understand what it is. And then let's give students some test prep tips. And then a lot of the time, let's make sure that students are confident in the most important learning and standards so that they walk into an assessment really confident and say, okay, this is just another moment where I'm going to share what I understand and where I know where I am. I think sometimes we build up that end of year assessment to be like this big thing, stresses kids out, stresses educators out. And certainly there is stress accompanied, not to diminish that, but we can lessen the stress and frame this as this is an opportunity to just see how our system is working for you all. So do what you can. And then we, of course, prepare kids in a more balanced way. I could go on and on about that, but I really want to lift systems up to say, put that test in its place. It's important. It helps us understand the system. But if we're really doing classroom assessment well and meaningful and not just having kids regurgitate and memorize facts, but we're really asking students to do meaningful assessment work, and then we're analyzing that and helping them grow, kids are going to walk in with more confidence. And Maria Ruiz Primo, Susan Burkhardt, and Linda Darling Hammett, so many of the researchers will say if kids walk in with more confidence, no matter what their skill level, they're going to do better.
Nicole, we've talked about a lot of aspects of assessment in a very brief amount of time. So no way did we talk about everything that we need to talk about. But what are 1 or 2 things that we haven't mentioned that you want the listeners to know?
It might be actually a reiteration, just this idea of stepping back to say, are we really clear about the learning goals we want students to achieve during any given time? And how do we share that with them? So the Design in 5 process is really about like making it doable and manageable and also making it meaningful so that students are really clear about where they're going, what the learning is, and that we as educators can align our assessments and our items and tasks to that, because that's where so much of the power is in terms of engagement and motivation.
Nicole, where can people find out more about you and the work you do?
Yes, I am on LinkedIn. Nicole Dimich, the Dimich, that's where you'll find me.
Thank you, Nicole. This has been great.
Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.